migrant people and is a part of growing wholesale practice speculatively criminalizing people not suspected of any crime. The Stop LAPD Spying Coalition will present on their work organizing against police surveillance. We have Hamid, Shakir, and Jamie here today.
So I'm going to go ahead and begin, and thank you very much for having us here at your conference. We're always very excited to share our perspectives on basically organizing to abolish policing. We're a grassroots organization. I'm just going to start with some introductions so that everybody can know who we are. My name is Jamie Garcia, and I am a registered nurse for about 13 years in the community of East LA. I'm also a community organizer, and I've been working with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition for about 10 years. I'm going to pass to Shakir.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Jamie. My name is Shakir Rahman. I'm a community organizer and community lawyer with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. I've been with the group for approaching 2 years now. And yeah, I'm also based in Los Angeles. I will pass to Hamid.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Hamid Khan, go by he, him. I am also with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, been there since the inception, along with Jamie, just about 10 and a half years ago. Been organizing in LA for about 30 plus years around immigrant rights, racial justice, economic justice, gender violence, homophobia, so a whole bunch of things. And all of this kind of converges into the history of state violence and the history of the national security police state. So that's what the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition does. So I'm going to pass it back to Jamie.
So I'm just going to kind of share a little bit about what we'll be discussing today. I'm really excited. It's a lot of culmination of community analysis and community research from folks who are impacted. The Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is located in Skid Row, one of the most policed and criminalized and brutalized areas probably in the nation. So when folks start off with trying to reform police or police surveillance in the context of privacy, often they leave out the most impacted individuals, which do not have access to such privileges as privacy, where their lives are bared to everybody living on the streets because of poverty. Inflicted poverty on people. So we're going to go through looking at the foundation of post 9/11 surveillance technologies and tactics. We're going to look at how in communities this actually kind of comes together programmatically through systems of offender-based policing, location-based policing, and micro hotspots. But we're also going to look at cycles of reform and how growing actors that are complicit in the expansion of police power enhance and promote the criminalizing of communities, for example, as we see in academia and nonprofits. So like I said, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition was formed in the summer of 2011 to not only organize against post 9/11 tactics of surveillance and how counterterrorism tactics and technology were being integrated into domestic law enforcement, but also to demonstrate how policing and particular tactics like community policing are being used to infiltrate, to disrupt and neutralize movements that are calling for the abolition of policing. So I really want to start this story kind of looking at the impacts before we start to break down the technologies and before we start to actually talk about how different institutions allow policing power to expand and to be legitimized in our communities. So I'm going to start the story talking about predictive policing, which has gone through very many name changes. This is often a tactic of police to try to make us feel comfortable with brutal law enforcement tactics. So it's been known as predictive policing, it's been known as precision policing, and now in Los Angeles, it's known as data-driven policing with some community input, of course. So predictive policing is a culmination of how legacies of policing tactics and partnerships utilize the veneer of science and technology to further legitimize the brutality of policing while formalizing and highly coordinating relationships between political officials, the police itself, and individuals invested in redevelopment to extract economic gains from BIPOC communities by containing, controlling, criminalizing, or ultimately banishing these communities. We're going to start in the Skid Row area and kind of look at the history of Skid Row and how it's been used to extract wealth. I mean, going all the way back from looking at the Pacific Railroad that was ended there in Central Division, but then kind of take us all the way further, looking at the 2040 redevelopment plan. And I think this is very important because we're considering and thinking about why neighborhoods are criminalized. And that's the kind of theme of this whole conference. And so we really need to look at that. It's not just looking at brutalizing people, but really looking at economic gain and how police are a part of that, protecting capital, as many people say. So I'm going to start to share my screen because I have a lot of maps that I'd like to show that demonstrate how surveillance technology and actually the war on our communities is actually kind of, mapped out, like with precision on how they will actually target people. But we're going to be looking at the community of Skid Row in particular. So give me just 1 second while I set up. And there we go. This should enhance it a little. Oops, I always push share. My apologies. I always do this. Okay, present is what I meant. Okay, so we're going to talk about how LAPD carves up our communities. And one way that it carves it up is by establishing 21 areas. And the particular community where Skid Row is located is called Central Division or Central Area. For those who are unfamiliar with Los Angeles, Skid Row is located right next to what is the redeveloping or gentrifying downtown Los Angeles. It's a city center of Los Angeles, and Skid Row has been there pretty much since the inception of Los Angeles. Like I was saying, if you go back into the history of Skid Row in the 1890s, really single room occupancy hotels, taverns, and little storefronts were all really created for people to be able to live there and to be cheap labor for development around the Los Angeles area. So it was really an entrapment where people were there, they were trapped, and their labor was extracted for them. And the idea of policing, individuals there, as far as, kind of sweeps, beatings on homeless people was very common. So even this idea of broken windows that was like an intellectual exercise for law enforcement where they tried to legitimize a practice that was really historic. So the idea of criminalizing people for being poor or for not having a home, needing to use the restroom, crossing the street, drinking because they didn't have a home, so they're drinking in public, was something that's a legacy in law enforcement. But where I really want to take us, and I'm going to start to talk about predictive policing, but kind of bring us up to speed real quick, is how redevelopment kind of couples itself with new policing tactics. So in 1956, you had the Bunker Hill redevelopment plan. And so during that time, you saw a lot of violations where the city came in and basically violated different hotels, single room occupancy hotels, and for not being up to code. And so instead of redeveloping those for the community that was local, it was cheaper for them to be demolished. So so then furthering on in around 1970s, the kind of outcome of that was a great amount of people, especially elders and BIPOC community, were homeless, and a lot of them ended up going into Skid Row in the Westlake area. So there was a growing amount of people who were displaced, and because of this, partnership between the city and redevelopers to basically kind of eradicate safe places for people to sleep. And during this time also in the 1964 4118D, which criminalized sleeping and sleeping on the streets, was instituted. So you see kind of that that kind of trifecta of effect on people who are homeless. So I think the story of Skid Row really starts, accelerates in 1976 with the containment plan. And the containment plan was a a result of the Central Business Redevelopment Plan. And so in this plan, basically, they wanted to eradicate Skid Row down to one block where there was nobody there that was homeless anymore. And there was a huge population of people who were unhoused or living in single room occupancy hotels. And so instead, and then there was like, you know, a big kind of organizing fight against that with community organizers from that area, from basically people who didn't want people who were unhoused or poor in their neighborhood kind of came together. And so they decided to do this informal plan called the containment plan. And so Skid Row was formally decided to be between, between Main Street, that kind of butts up against the new gentrifying downtown, Alameda, which is east of downtown, and then north going to 7th Street and south, north going to 3rd Street and south going to 7th Street. So this kind of became the containment area of Skid Row. And it's really important because as I start to tell the story of predictive policing, you'll see how predictive policing just kind of carries on the legacies of containing what became the containment of Skid Row. And the buffer zones were areas that were highly policed by foot patrol, because the idea was to make the centralized area of Skid Row a place where people who were unhoused would be comfortable, right? They would have a home, or like basically a shelter, or they could camp on the street, or they could live in a single room occupancy. They could get a free meal, they could get social services, and they would become uncomfortable to go into the buffer zone or leave the area, because police would be patrolling those areas and kind of force them back into the containment area. Okay, so that's just the legacy of Skid Row. So now I'm going to jump really quickly into predictive policing, and I apologize for moving really fast, but I think when we think about neighborhoods, we have to think about how they're formed and then how police become a part of that and play a role in that. So during the predictive policing fight that was started in 2016 through the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, we filed a bunch of California public records requests, right? And so we were able to obtain actual mission sheets from law enforcement where they, basically through PredPol, which was an algorithm that designated hotspots as high crime areas or locations where crime was possibly going to happen. They would give these to basically patrol officers and say, patrol these areas and look for suspicious people or look for, possible crimes that are going to happen. This is considered a location-based tactic, right? And so this was instituted in LAPD in 2009 was when they started to pilot this program in LAPD. So at the same time, they're also piloting a program called Operation Laser, which is LA Strategic Extraction and Restoration. So extracting people, and in their own literature, they referred to people in the community as tumors that needed to be extracted, right? So this included an offender-based program that utilized a risk assessment to assign people a certain level of risk that were tracked through the community, and offline officers were given almost like what most wanted posters to go after people to try to violate them for anything. And that literature you can see also within documents we received through our public records request. It also includes a location-based component, which you'll see these kind of black boxes that are designed to basically, it says that these areas are high crime areas. And so they would patrol these areas aggressively looking for chronic offenders or for crime as well. And then there was also micro hotspots that were considered anchor points. And so in the beginning of this presentation, I talked about how predictive policing is the coordination of city officials, police, and redevelopers, right? So anchor points were areas where the intervention into a specific like home, a property, a business, an intersection that was considered the micro hotspot or termed the anchor point. They would intervene by trying to evict people from those properties or using the citywide nuisance abatement program to evict people, right? And so that was how they intervened. And again, we need to think about interventions, and the interventions are criminalizing, where there's incarceration, or essentially making people homeless. And this is the way that police orient themselves in our community when we're thinking about how they deal with issues that are rising in the neighborhood. And when we think about now, we're going to put this all into the context of Skid Row. So now this is the intervention on how we're thinking about people who are poor, who are unhoused. And so we have to really think about how this impacts people and who is filling the jails and the prisons. So now I'm going to take us into what we did, which was the concentration of predpol hotspots. And this is a 6-month concentration. So now remember how in 1976, they created the buffer zones around Skid Row. So if we look at this map, this area right here, these are the buffer zones. So predpol traditionally just took over the areas that were used to contain Skid Row, because we already know that Skid Row had the Safer Cities Initiative, which basically assigned about 50 more police officers and several narcotic agents just to the area of Skid Row to patrol and police Skid Row. So this predpol essentially took over the buffer zones to make sure that the new gentry or the gentrifiers in downtown and the developers in downtown would not have to deal with the basically burgeoning homeless community of unhoused people in downtown. So this is also another example of how we repeated the study and looked at hotspots from June of 2018. And this is more of a 4-month period of hotspots. And again, you see Skid Row being in this lower area. And again, you kind of see this buffer zone establishing itself to be sure that nobody is exiting this area, right? So as I said before, I want to kind of give us a tiny little background about the citywide nuisance abatement program. So in the 90s, when basically downtown was being blighted, right, where there was not a lot of services there, they were kind of just letting it go to shambles, right? What happens is that property values drop, right? And real estate speculators can come in and just buy hotels for really cheap. Right, but during this time, the citywide nuisance abatement program was solidifying itself. Now, this was a program that was being piloted for 10 years, and actually the first piloted program was in Los Angeles. So the point of the citywide nuisance abatement program was to abate properties, right? And to bring in more surveillance, to bring in more criminalization, and basically to kind of take over the properties, which ultimately did happen. And so if you look at this property up here on 451 South Main Street, this property was formerly known as the Frontier Hotel, a single room occupancy hotel, which many of our members that, because we're housed in Skid Row under the Los Angeles Community Action Network, and many of our members actually lived in that hotel and remember the criminalization, the fact that the landlords didn't consider them tenants, and they did something called the 26-day shuffle to make sure they could never be tenants and would move them from room to room. Anyways, so CNAP decides in 1999 a full-on assault of a single room occupancy hotels. And so if you look at Main Street right here, right, this is the buffer zone. They start this assault on hotels right here, trying to abate hotels in the gentrifying downtown area that's here. Well, now let's fast forward to 2018. These areas are all anchor points, or the micro hotspots that I spoke about, that are part of Operation Laser, right? So there, in this hotel right across the way, the Roslyn Hotel is a single room occupancy hotel that's protected under the SRO trust fund that was kind of preserved during these fights through community organizing to maintain a minimal amount of single room occupancies for folks in Skid Row. So all these areas are now considered anchor points and are highly policed, right? If we go down here to this area on 5th and San Pedro, and this will soon make sense, this is also an anchor point where you have many SROs that are also in this area. So 5th and San Pedro is also considered an area where they're using the nuisance abatement law, they're using evictions, and they're highly policing that area as well. So I kind of talked about the Central Business Redevelopment Plan. So let's move forward a little bit. We talked about CNAP 1999. Safer Cities Initiative of 2016 under William Bratton comes in, starts to highly police Skid Row during that time, making it just, very uncomfortable to be poor, right? So you're continually criminalized. So if we fast forward now to 2018, right, and think about what is happening in downtown, in 2018, Los Angeles City Council introduces the 2040 plan, right? And this is the rezoning of Skid Row, right? And this idea of wanting to deconcentrate poverty. So how do they do that? They do that through rezoning. They do that through the resurfacing of 4118D, which many community organizers were able to fight that off through the Jones Act, allowing people to be able to sleep from the hours of 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. in Skid Row. But now they want to bring it back with even more force. And that's a current fight in City Council. And the rezoning plan is a current fight in 2018. So if you look at the buffer zones that we talked about, right, of the predpol hotspots, and you look at the anchor points, they're encroaching into the community of Skid Row. So in this next map, and this is my last slide, these were the proposed 2018 laser zones, right? And in the 2040 plan that they have proposed, they're going to reduce where affordable housing can be built. Now affordable housing will be contained to San Pedro, which is located down here, just on the tip of the laser zones, then down to 5th Street here, and then down to Central. This will be the only area that affordable housing will be allowed to be built. The rest of the area will be open to market rate housing and redevelopers to come in and develop it how they please. And you know that the SRO trust fund will not be able to compete in buying property with these redevelopers into a blighted area, right, where property values will be much cheaper. So the point of this presentation is to demonstrate how city officials, how policing tactics, and how redevelopers work in conjunction to either extract, well, the thing is to extract capital. And how are they going to do it? Either by extracting through labor, which is the history of Skid Row, or basically containing, criminalizing, and banishing people in order to get the land that they're sitting on. And so I think what's really important, and I'm going to pass to Shakir now, is for us to realize that the intervention in Skid Row to people that are basically an end result of urbanization, where people are left in poverty, that the ideas that are coming in are ideas of location-based policing, offender-based policing, and city municipal codes like 4118D, essentially to target and incarcerate people. And I mean, a lot of end results, and I could go further on about how chronic offenders were also possibly killed in laser zones. So, and that's a further story, but since we're speaking about neighborhoods, I really wanted to demonstrate that trifecta and the harm that it brings to our communities. So sorry, that was a lot, but I tried to get it all in there. So thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so I want to kind of talk about, building on what Jamie's been talking about, kind of the history and lineages of different past programs that these new data-driven policing programs, predictive policing programs, different police technologies are the lineage that they live in, as well as kind of the evolution that gets us here, which I think thinking about the role of police reform and efforts to kind of repair, refine, improve policing are a part of this story. And especially thinking about the context of this conference of policing of association, policing of relationships, policing of neighborhoods, I think we see that lineage. And also as part of that story, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of academic complicity and all of that, as well as nonprofit complicity and all of that. If I'm taking too long, Jamie, and trying to cover all those things, feel free, please, to cut me off and move us along. But so basically, yeah. So I think beginning with, I think this point that I just want to reiterate or lift up that Jamie kind of said at the end of the role of policing. We have a sense of, we always have a clear sense of how policing plays a role in regulating labor and regulating in kind of warehousing people, in managing kind of the workforce in that way. But also this point about how policing's role in neighborhoods is, of course, to extract and banish people, but also sometimes to help, like with the example that we see in Skid Row, of maintaining kind of through blight, like through denial, dispossession, like kind of keeping neighborhoods under-resourced and poor. That's also plays a role in the process of extraction by helping suppress kind of values and keeping a part of the community, you know, blighted and underserved, that then allows later on, like we're starting to see now, developers and real estate investors to come in and then start acquiring those properties. And the kind of that whole process involves and requires a lot of over time kind of coordination between these different actors that Jamie laid out. There's of course the police. Then also there's, for example, the citywide nuisance abatement program that she talked about, which is municipal prosecutors who declare buildings nuisances, which allows landlords to make evictions or allows turnover, often is directly complicit in or directly an instrument of clearing out a building where there might be rent controlled tenants in order to sell that property or to bring in you know, higher paying tenants. So that coordination, we've been talking about the different elements of that through history. Predictive policing and data-driven policing, what Jamie was giving examples of through Predpol and the hotspots, is now a form that coordination takes. And the way that the Stop LAPD spying first kind of, my understanding is, like, started looking at that or started kind of noticing and mapping that out is going back to, and I'll show some slides too, that map that Jamie shared of the hotspots in Skid Row. The reason that this map, I mean, Jamie was talking about the kind of process and role of containment in this, but what's, I think, interesting is stepping back a moment and thinking about how these, like, data-driven policing, algorithmic policing, often the mainstream kind of critique that's leveled at them is that, okay, it's a matter of bad data coming in, and so obviously you're going to get bad data coming out. You know, it's going to be the racial biases, the history of racial profiling, of targeting of certain communities means that the same places that have always been policed are going to continue to be policed. If that was the story, then you would of course expect Skid Row, which is in this 2015 map, this kind of the blank area here, to be the most, you know, hotspot based policed, most algorithmically policed part of the city, because that's where historically the most enforcement and criminalization has happened. Skid Row has had, you know, through the Safer Cities initiative that Jamie mentioned and other things, the largest concentration of policing and enforcement in Los Angeles and maybe even the country and beyond. So you would expect for these hotspots to then be most concentrated in Skid Row. But as we started mapping these out, we started to realize, no, the story that's happening is actually kind of consistent with the broader story that housing organizers will always tell you about Skid Row, that Skid Row organizers will tell you is just about this process of containment and kind of encroachment. That you can't explain that just through this, like, dirty data in, dirty data out. And it requires kind of starting to look at that broader ecosystem of the role of developers, the role of other institutions, the role of municipal prosecutors, the role of nonprofits and legal reform and all of that. So out of that emerged, you know, efforts to kind of map all of that out, and to map out the history again that predictive policing, these databases and these data mining systems operated. And so that history, I think it's important to excavate that. Even, you know, when we talk about surveillance technologies, that we shouldn't get kind of too caught up in the, like, novelty of the technologies, that a lot of what the lineage that those technologies represent often is, you know, practices of analog surveillance that go back a very long time. So when some of the history that we try to root our work in is thinking about, for example, lantern laws, which were laws that required Black and indigenous people and freed Black people to carry around a lantern at night to self-identify themselves. Those are kind of, you see in those today you see the lineage of, for example, stop and frisk regime and that kind of covers the broken windows policing in Skid Row, as well as, in other police departments, of forcing people to identify themselves and expose themselves to the gaze of policing. Same with facial recognition is kind of along those lines too. But coming back to what I'm saying about the sort of ecosystem that surrounds data-driven policing and is, producing that data, is generating that coordination. The coalition then started mapping out the role of or the kind of the inputs and outputs and way that these algorithms operate, that sort of decenters the algorithm and goes, incorporates all these other institutions and effects that that go just beyond the role of the technology itself. And when you start to look at that, you begin to recognize that those kind of institutions are driving this process that's largely over time been a process of reforming past practices. For example, gang databases and gang injunctions are things that in California, have been sort of pioneered for years and have always been used to kind of criminalize association, to criminalize kinship. Over time, through this process of those practices being criticized or chipped away at, and often chipped away at using either legal tools or the language of they're not accurate enough, they're not accountable enough, they're not fair enough, the impact is too disparate, that kind of thing, that leads to the sort of refinement of it, as well as kind of the evolution of it into a lot of these practices that we're talking about now. So, when we're talking about predictive policing, one form that takes, and LAPD had a number of, LAPD had this predpol program that we've been talking about that is a kind of for-profit company that sells products, that sells this predictive policing technology to different police departments. In addition to that, LAPD also had what Jamie was talking about, Operation Laser, which was a homegrown kind of algorithmic policing program that included an offender-based, or which is kind of targeting individuals, component called chronic offender bulletins, which were basically these secret like hit lists that were generated using data mining, partly algorithmically, but partly also just, crime analysts sitting down, looking at all these data sources that were kind of integrated using Palantir to then pick these targets of who they were going to go after. So all of that, in a way that obviously is an evolution of gang databases and kind of marking people speculatively based on who they know, where they live, who they associate with, who they hang out with, and kind of, predictively criminalizing them for that. So that, though, now evolves a little bit through process of reform to become this broader kind of speculatively criminalizing people based on even a broader range of inputs of, not just where you live, but kind of how much police contact you've had, how much police contact that neighborhood has had, and all these things. So when that first emerged, when the Operation Laser program first launched in Los Angeles, or not at first, but at some point after that, it was very much promoted as a reform. So this on the screen now, I have this kind of report that was put out by the Vera Institute, which is a national kind of nonprofit like think tank. This is a report that was put out in conjunction with the Bureau of Justice Assistance at the US DOJ, kind of promoting this new model of data-driven policing, of crime analytics, as a model that police departments across the country should adopt. Talking about how it's a new paradigm is the language they use that will make policing more efficient, that'll help allocate resources more efficiently, make police more cost effective, all of that. So then once the community then in Los Angeles is experiencing the harm and the toll of Operation Laser and the violence of it, as people are then beginning to criticize that and saying, well, this is how it's really working in practice. These are just secret hit lists that you're using to go after the people that you've always wanted to go after. The police then point to this, a resource like this as a reason that, as a way to justify and defend their practices. So then fast forward to over the years, the Organizing Against Operation Laser, as well as Predpol, builds up in the community and eventually succeeds within April 2019, the LAPD announces that they're no longer going to be doing Operation Laser, that they're ending that program because of the kind of, the toll of it that's been exposed by the community over the years. A year later, in April 2020, LAPD announced that they're going to stop using the Predpol program that Jamie was showing about, those hotspots and that we've been talking about. The very same month, though, that they announced that they're going to stop using Predpol, this was April 2020, they released this kind of vision document that I have on the screen now called Data Informed Community Focused Policing. So this basically, and it's a 60-page report or something, but is again, comes out right at the same time that they say they're going to end Predpol. And basically what this report is doing is kind of casting a lot of the data mining that LAPD had been doing under those programs, now presenting them as the goal of them is to increase accountability, is to make policing kind of more fair, and like here, we will continue to implement systems that measure accountability, measure results, improve efficiency, and provide overall accountability. So now these same programs that have been over time discredited as racist, as brutal, as harmful in all these ways, are being repackaged as tools for police reform, kind of borrowing from the language of police reform. And I'm not going to go into every detail of this report, but if you see it, if you kind of, once you dive into it, you recognize that you see all the same elements of those programs just kind of renamed. It's the same surveillance sources, the same inputs, same data inputs. It's the same Palantir system that is processing those. It's the same targeting of locations and individuals and through hit lists. And it's the same outputs, of course. The outputs are always going to be criminalization, policing, police stops, evictions, nuisance abatements, all of those same things. It's just now kind of recouched in this new language that is being supplied by police reformers and police, which is often kind of taking place in through academic research, through kind of nonprofit advocacy. And so that's and I'm going to give some examples of that, the advocacy and the academic complicity. But so that's the evolution of, or the rebranding really of LAPD's own practices. At the same time, as I said, Predpol, kicked out of Los Angeles by the community after exposing kind of its toll, also goes through a very, very similar transformation. So this is Predpol's website. Their tagline here is predict critical events and gain actionable insight, the predictive policing company trademark. The next year, wrong thing here. Earlier this year, Predpol, in response to that same kind of discrediting and exposing of the harm, also rebrands and changes its name from Predpol now to Geolytica. And their tagline now, exactly where it's previously said, predictive policing trademark, is we run operations for public safety teams to be more transparent, accountable, and effective. So that, that evolution is like sort of directly tracks what happens with the LAPD system too. And you see here, this is their kind of tagline on their Twitter page. It's data-driven community policing, which sounds a lot like data-informed community-focused policing of the LAPD's transformation. So all of that, doesn't happen in a vacuum, like I said. And to understand that, you need to be looking at this broader ecosystem and be thinking about how it's not just the specific program or the specific policy that's harmful and that we need to be organizing against and trying to dismantle, because if you take out, for example, if you just take out Predpol, it can get replaced then with this new thing, with this data-driven community policing, whatever, because the rest of that ecosystem that's helping generate, that's helping feed the data, that's helping feed the branding and the concept of these is going to remain. And just to give an example of that, a lot of the coalition's work has been through public records research and public records requests using the California Public Records Act and as a tool for kind of organizing and research. We recently uncovered, for example, these emails, and I'll try to kind of rush through this, but But basically, this is an email that we recently found from a law professor who is, his name's Andrew Ferguson. And he's sort of, he's written a book on big data policing and is, you know, kind of self-described as an expert on predictive policing. This is an email from Professor Ferguson to this person, Jeremy Hefner, who was the product manager of this product called Hunch Lab that was previously owned by this company called Azavia, and then since has been acquired by ShotSpotter, which is a company that uses kind of microphones, or their primary product was microphones that detected gunshots. Now they've, after acquiring Hunch Lab, have now branched more into this location-based predictive policing. And so this email, basically, I'm just going to try to be quick here, is Ferguson just kind of emailing the Hunch Lab folks and saying, hey, let's say a city came to you and were interested in using Hunch Lab to improve police accountability. Do you think that would, you know, how do you think that would work? You know, they talk, and then he basically describes, basically, what if you were selling two products? One was a product that is sort of this patrol management kind of predictive policing technology. And the other product is, you know, more about police accountability than crime reduction. You've got product A and product B. Of course, he says both products would do the same thing. You know, they both would be doing crime protection and patrol management. It would just be pitched differently, and, you know, they'd be collecting different data. He explains this could, like, just rebranding your product in that same way, you know, having the same technology, the same purpose, but just, you know, framing it differently, selling it differently. That could mean that you could then sell it to cities that maybe, you know, would otherwise be getting grief from, he says, from the community for the whole predictive thing, which has now been discredited, has been cast as racist, has been, you know, the toll of it has been exposed. And you'll get credit from the community for caring about police accountability. So this kind of concept, and I'm not saying, you know, any one academic or any one kind of, you know, even before going back to the Vera Institute or whatever, that any one of these examples is the kind of, you know, villain that is helping these systems evolve. It's just the role of these kind of institutions and the way that evolution happens depends on all of those institutions moving. Oh, whoops! I turned my camera off. I don't know why I did that. So, okay, I just want to give two more examples of that nonprofit and academic complicity, and then I'm going to pass it on. So, as I said, so Los Angeles, you know, the community kind of forced LAPD to stop using its Predpol and Operation Laser programs, so those have been evolving in time. I want to give another example of how kind of how that kind of efforts to confront these systems has evolved and it has also just proceeded in other cities. So one is in Santa Cruz, where last summer in June or July, it was sort of after the uprising, and kind of very much the organizing against it was couched in the language of the uprising. Headlines were that Santa Cruz became the first US city to ban predictive policing. That was a headline in the LA Times. This was a campaign kind of pushed by the ACLU of Northern California, as you know, along with kind of community groups. The legislation that Santa Cruz enacted was promoted by the ACLU as a ban, and that, you know, that it's in the kind of you know, using the, as I said, the language and the momentum of the movement against policing that was forming on the streets at the time. And you know, the ACLU talked about the ordinance as a ban, and that's how the headlines describe it. But if you look at the language of it, which I have in the second picture there, the top right corner, and you just read it, it basically it you know, doesn't actually say that predictive policing is being banned. Rather, it says that it'll be unlawful for the city to use it prior to obtaining, and I can't highlight, so I hope people can follow along, but prior to obtaining city council approval based on city council's finding that the technology meets scientifically validated and peer-reviewed research, protects and safeguards the civil liberties of all people, and will not perpetuate bias. So we didn't mention this earlier, but Predpol is founded by And Predpol is based in Santa Cruz, so that's where the headquarters of the company is. And it's founded by a pair of UCLA academics, one of whom is an anthropologist, another one is an applied mathematician, who founded the company first by working with LAPD to test Predpol, deploy it in the Foothill Division that's in the San Fernando Valley, and then published their results in kind of peer-reviewed research and academic journals, research that has since been rejected and discredited. But the point is that this was always part of their this was always part of their model. This was always part of their strategy for how they presented and promoted this stuff. Is it's going to be peer-reviewed. It's all based on scientific validation. And so in that same LA Times article that trumpets this ban, you also have the CEO of Predpol saying that they welcome the new legislation, that the company is confident its software is not racially biased and therefore meets the conditions in the city's ordinance. So Predpol, as well as I can't remember now, but I think there are other companies too that also, along with the ACLU, celebrated this ban. And so what this ban is doing then is, it basically is, and by the way, Santa Cruz had been at this point not even using Predpol for a while. They'd stopped using it, I think, in response to community pressure. But then this ordinance comes along that's celebrated by Predpol and these companies. So it's not quite, it's not banning it, it's not abolishing it, in a way that these kinds of practices of trying to reform and validate and refine these are codifying it. They're establishing the exact kind of criteria and pathway and just blueprint for how, if you want to use technology like this, this is the pathway you need to take, and the companies that are doing it are really excited about that. So that's one example. The other example of academic complicity, and again, there too, obviously, with UCLA academics being directly responsible for developing this technology, that's obviously one form of academic complicity, of academics literally building the weapons that police are using. And we also recently actually uncovered that UCLA not only is hosting that research and then then in response to the community defending that as well, the academic freedom and we don't control what our faculty are doing, and those kinds of values. At the same time, we also were later able to expose the UCLA, it's not just that professors at UCLA are doing this research. The UCLA Foundation, which is I think the endowment for the university, purchased a stake in Predpol, an early kind of stake of I think maybe several thousand, or at least or several hundred thousand, maybe even shares in the company, through UCLA's venture capital arm. So the university is also then profiting off of and directly invested in the company. So just this other example here is of kind of UCLA research, and this is another kind of form of the academic.
This one we can wrap up for questions and stuff that Hamid will facilitate.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just share the CSP thing. Sorry, yeah, I kind of lost track of time here, but so the Community Safety Partnerships is a kind of community policing program that was first piloted in a number of public housing developments in Los Angeles. And then years later, this study is published that about the kind of efficacy or evaluating the program. So the study, as you see in the second picture, the lead researchers, one is Georgia Leap, who is a social welfare professor who actually happens to be married to, I think, a former LAPD or current LAPD deputy chief. The second person there is Jeffrey Brantingham, who is this anthropology professor who's, as I said, the co-founder and owner of Predpol. So these are people who, have their own kind of connections to police in those ways. But the thing I also want to highlight even more important is who funded this research. And so it's a lot of this goes back to a lot of what Jamie was talking about. So the first listed there is the Ballmer Group. So that's Steve Ballmer, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, owner of a stadium, kind of very involved in real estate development. is one of the funders. Caruso there is one of the largest private real estate developers in the country. That fourth person, Cindy Miskowski, is I think a principal of Ring Group, which is this also large real estate conglomerate. So a lot of these, who's funding these programs or funding the academic evaluation and vetting of these programs, which then LAPD later cited last summer when they expanded the CSP program from those pilots into a full-fledged bureau, is coming from developers. And a lot of those developers also, including the Balmer Foundation, actually funded the pilot programs in the first place. This is just an excerpt I'll end here, showing that the Balmer Group provided just literally purchased this operation of the Community Safety Partnerships program in one of the city housing developments, and not just that, but stipulated that any site that Balmer Foundation was funding in this way would then later need to be required that it needed to be funded by the city. So they're basically saying, we'll donate, and I think this was $750,000 maybe, donation to fund this program, saying, okay, we're gonna fund this now, start doing this like community policing program, and then the city's gonna need to pay for it out of its own dollar afterwards. So yeah, so that's just kind of a range of the academic and reform kind of complicity.
Thank you, Shakir. Thank you, Jamie. A lot of information shared. So I think we're going to now start having a conversation around folks have any questions or comments, and we can maybe, I guess technically we have till about 11:30. So just already, Lily, thank you for sharing your comments. And also, a question as well. And I think I'm just going to read, take off from what you just noted. So we're seeing an emergency policy model across a bunch of areas. Thanks for flagging this. And then why would ACLU agree to this scientific quote unquote validation loophole? So I think that's where this is the key question. And I think in order for us to address this question, one is, and I posted an op-ed that was under my name and Pete White, who's the executive director of Los Angeles Community Action Network, with one of the largest and the most preeminent, people's movement around race and poverty, based out of Skid Row, which is our home as well, where ACLU has been. I mean, we just call them as functionaries of the state. I mean, it's just a 100%, just right there. And that's what really the work of the Stop LAPD Spying begins, because historically speaking, the way surveillance had always been seen was, and in a very privileged way, this was an invasion of privacy. And of course it's an invasion of privacy. But what the coalition did was to really desensationalize and kind of just challenge that very narrow assertion. And through our research and through impact and being based in Skid Row, looked at it that no, this is a primary tool. This is the edge of the policing knife, where surveillance is used with the intent to cause harm. That how race and poverty and suspect bodies will be policed. So that's why we saw over the last 30, 35 years ago, the development of intelligence-led policing, which was nothing more than, just stopping Black folks and brown folks and undocumented folks or immigrant folks and indigenous folks, just by virtue of them being in public. So in a sense, now this whole sort of scientific thing around like behavioral surveillance, but then also, so the suspicious activity reporting program comes in, see something, say something comes in, but see something, say something is nothing more than what maybe 300 years ago lantern laws used to be, that, how dare somebody is out there, and it has become a license for racial profiling. So I think that's where the intersection comes in, that for groups like nonprofit law firms like ACLU and others, it is sort of like, driven by constitutional protections. But the question becomes that for many communities, if the Constitution itself, and I'm speaking to a whole bunch of law school folks, that if the Constitution inherently by itself is a blueprint for oppression, so how can we seek any remedies, and how can we, and only maybe you are able to afford a lawyer, maybe you are able to fight a case, fine, but many folks in our communities ourselves don't have that privilege, so the intent to cause harm. So a lot of this reform is couched as community control. So we have been organizing against the things around ACLU's model ordinance about the community control over police surveillance, because what it does is that, number one, it legitimizes surveillance, and number two, we're looking at a tactical operations which is inherently anti-Black. which is inherently anti-immigrant, which is there using behavioral surveillance and identifying people that who are considered the insurgents. So I think that's where the values of the coalition come into play as well, which really guide us that number one, this is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. And obviously that continuation of history is of the national security police state, of the track, to trace, to monitor, with the intent to cause harm, to control, contain, and criminalize communities. So that has been going on now tactically. You know, this whole intellectual exercise around broken windows, this was no intellectual exercise. This was just another tactical operation, which was just based on social scientists of George Kelling and James Q. Wilson, you know, who just came up and provided a sort of an intellectual roadmap that this is how you can cover it up. This is how you can claim that, well, gee, social scientists are saying that. And that's exactly what we see the academic complicity now very much on the front lines in providing roadmaps. We're seeing a revolving door culture in the police, where people who've been cops for many years, now they become academics. I mean, look at Sean Malinowski, who was roundly discredited, was a deputy chief of LAPD, was a creator of Operation Laser, is now at the crime lab at University of Chicago, and this, that, and the other. So you know, there's a lot to be said, but I just quickly want to show a couple of things that how we have been doing our work and what it means to us. So this is what we have been working on, looking at the broader information sharing environment. That when we look at the intent to cause harm, looking at that how information is exchanged, information is shared, information is used to contain and control and criminalize people between public sectors, private sectors, law enforcement agencies, international groups, this, that, and the other. And I'll just give you a quick example, and then we'll go into questions. That we released a report, and I'll post the link to that on LA County's Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS. Now, this is what we found is the scale of information sharing that is happening at DCFS. So now you're looking at families with children and kids going into foster homes, and you know, just kids being abused and dying. And here we have like this massive information sharing that is taking place. So want to stop there and see if folks have any questions or any comments of what you've heard, and would be happy to answer it.
I just wanted to say it's been an honor to hear you all speak. Thank you so much for giving us all this historical and economic and academic context. It's so foundational for abolition education. And thank you so much. We're so grateful to have you be a part of this conference. I saw one more question from Lily that was further up that was about ShotSpotter. I heard Shakir talk about that, but I don't know if he touched on the specific piece that was so this is from Lily. Gentrification came up in Flacco's talk yesterday too. Have you seen or have you been seeing attempts to use surveillance technologies like ShotSpotter to bring down property values in conjunction with gang injunctions to facilitate property buy-up and redevelopment?
Yeah, and I think that and absolutely, just the quick answer is very much so, but that also needs to be seen in the broader intersection and context of how communities and neighborhoods are being deemed as laser zones, and then within them are these anchor points, which are crime triggers. You bring in the citywide nuisance abatement programs. ShotSpotters have been installed just to sort of demonize, and to supposedly identify individuals as well. And then predictive policing comes in, and then you bring in the helicopter fleet to support this thing. So in a sense, it is just as we would say that throwing the book at somebody. To criminalize them. Here we see like throwing the book of tactical operations into criminalizing whole neighborhoods, which then, and just to share this too, that in the next 6 to 8 weeks, we will be releasing a report on exactly these issues, that how neighborhoods are being criminalized, which is more like predictive policing 2.0, that how these zoning and rezoning and the gentrification and development that is happening in the Central Division and also in South Central Los Angeles is very much driven by these programs and how they're in cahoots with the developers, with real estate companies, with the city attorneys and law enforcement agencies. I don't know, Jamie or Shakir, if you want to add to that.
I wanted to see, Shakir, I know you have the image of the data-informed community-focused policing pamphlet, where we're trying to break down and demonstrate to people the kind of garrison state and how technology has infiltrated the community. Do you have it, Shakir, where you can just show and we can talk about the area crime, the area community crime intelligence centers, basically data analytics centers that are being moved into neighborhoods now. So there's a really great image. Yeah, so this image right here kind of is an example. Maybe make it a little bit larger, Shakir, so we can just look at the image. Let's see.
Wait, like where the
Just the image, just so we can show the image. Yeah, is there, because you had it larger. Yeah. Well, yeah, just the image.
I don't know what you mean.
Right there, perfect. So when we look at how LAPD kind of breaks down a community, and this is the thing that we have to realize, it's like war on the community. So they're using militarized technology, counterterrorism tactics, and they're bringing them into the community to basically map us, use social network analysis, use technologies like ShotSpotter, which is not the only one, which kind of like, as Hamid was saying, gives them the excuse and the reasoning to come into a community, guns blazing, and, gives them the data to legitimize them being there, right? So LAPD currently is using the SARA model, the scanning, analysis, response, and assessment to organize. And this is an old model, right? But this is how they're, framing their tactics and moving. But they use something called the community safety operation centers. And we are calling them mini fusion centers, basically, if people are aware of fusion centers. But they're data analytics centers where data comes in, crime analysts are there. And the community safety operation centers are per bureau, and there's 4 bureaus in LAPD, right? And so they kind of get data, and the analysts are there, and like intelligence-led policing, it's commanders on top down to the bottom, telling the foot patrol what to do. And then you have your community safety partnerships, which, they actively have said it in the past when they rolled these out, is like, we're looking for infiltrators. We're looking for people who will snitch on community members, who will partner with us, who will divide the community, who will, and like I spoke earlier, we're talking about how, people are resisting this. And so who comes in and starts to be like, well, the police are nice, we should partner with them, we should do this, they should play football with our kids, but they're the same people that kill our kids too. And then you look at over to the right, you have the kind of like analysis part where you have the LAPD network communication systems and the records management system, which is like basically a system that starts to be able to pull from multiple databases and kind of correlate information. So if it's body camera information, if it's information from a digital in-car video system that you are a part of, that maybe they have your face, your DNA, they're able to extract that information and bring it together rapidly. Again, same tactics, new technology that are making it more dangerous for them to track and really see who is out there, right? They've bought data from Papa John's. I mean, they are as much data as they can get on a community, they're getting it. And then, you have like down here, what I was talking about, the area crime and community intelligence centers, ACCICs. Now there's 21 areas or divisions in LAPD, right? 4 bureaus, 21 of those. So now the ACCICs are per area. So now we have 21 data analytics centers that are within communities doing that same kind of mapping and looking around. So what you're really seeing, and then this all kind of comes together. Palantir is very used, very much so connected to the Joint Regional Intelligence Center. Hamid spoke about suspicious activity reporting that goes to the fusion centers. A lot of data goes to the fusion centers. It becomes a national federal network. And, that's the point. That's what William Bratton was bringing in nationally, was like, we need to share information with everybody. Like, it just, no more departments sharing or, secret and who's going to get the bad guy, but it's like everybody share every bit of data that you have. And so really you have this garrison state where, again, the intervention in our communities that are suffering from poverty, that, LAPD takes up, $3 billion in its budget is going to technologies of war to map out our communities. And there's just really no way that this is going to solve poverty. I mean, it's just very clear. And that's why these reforms, and when we think about them, we have to stop, giving that fodder to them to rename themselves, to say they're going to be more gentle, because that's not what we need. And I think that's the biggest movement that we're seeing right now. Is this, basically saying what our communities need, and they need resources.
Thank you, Jamie. Are there any other questions?
We must have been very clear.
You were very good. This was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was amazing. Thank you.
Well, great. I'm sorry, Colleen, did you have a question?
Just another comment to with the rest of the choir. I'm just soaking it all in. There's so much information in the last hour. I've learned that I didn't know before, and it's a little overwhelming. I'm thinking in terms of accountability, how we actually do hold police accountable for these acts of surveillance that are acts of war. And how we get that message out, because there's all the fear mongering. White people are convinced that they need these cameras to protect their property. So we have the spy street lights here in San Diego that were put up for 3 years without us, while our city attorney and mayor lied to city council about what they were doing, said that they were environmentally friendly, and then slipped and bragged about all the investigations that they were using from this information. So luckily we've had that shut down temporarily here in San Diego, thanks to the surveillance commission Lily's helped with, and others. But so much needs to be done. We need to spy on the police.
Well said.
Thank you all.
Of course. Well, I mean, I think, and that's where a lot of our work has been kind of digging deep and really just being very intersectional as well. And I invite you all to join us in our weekly meetings. I mean, we have been, we're based out of Skid Row. We would meet every week on Tuesday evenings. And then, that's how we strategize. The model that we have created is very much community driven. Even for public records, we don't seek out lawyers. I mean, the public records are filed, but as a way for us to gather information in order to tell the story. Not sort of like, one particular issue or anything. We come together, with the community sort of kind of frames, okay, what questions we want to know, how do we tell this story to folks, but also to look at it very intersectionally as well. So now, because of COVID, on March 24th of 2020, we had to pivot, and we've been having weekly webinars. And this coming week, Tuesday, we're going to have our 67th webinar, which is the 67th Tuesday since March 24th that we've been having a meeting, and we may have maybe missed about 2 or 3 Tuesdays in between. And the first week is a conversation around the intersection of the police state and gender and sexuality, that how it is nuanced, how it is specifically impacts gender identities, how it impacts how people identify themselves, how they celebrate their sexuality, and in that, looking at the impact of predictive policing and hotspot policing, how it impacts sex workers, and what does it mean, how it impacts queer trans communities and other folks. The second Tuesday of the month from 6 to 8 is on the police state and the war on youth, that how youth are being particularly targeted, how this whole impact and this violence against youth is increasingly taking on a national security significance, where we had gang injunctions, we had gang databases, and various other things, and now it's taking on this frameworks of countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism. So how radicalization theories are being inserted and how youth are being impacted. The third Tuesday is more like a general a meeting, which is what is the current political landscape like. And the fourth Tuesday is committed to looking at data-driven policing and these new sort of emerging tactics that are constantly using pseudoscience and mask the impact. So we welcome you to join us. We posted the website. There's a bunch of reports in there too. And yeah, so I'll pass it on to Jamie and Shakir if they have any other comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that was really interesting. We did an interview with a lot of the founders from the coalition that kind of came together in 2011 to basically start this organization. And one thing that I think as abolitionists, we have to really kind of ground ourselves in is Susan Alba, who does a lot of lawyering for basically immigrant rights and representing people who are, at risk for deportation or being deported. Kind of shared the story of when she was able to go down and spend time with Zapatistas and was invited into the space to share and learn about tactics. And one story she shared, which really made me realize why the coalition really spends its time and has spent its time over the last decade, like digging deep, is because, and she shared the story that Zapatistas spent 10 years organizing and strategizing their rebellion in order to preserve their land and their people and to, for their own safety and for their own self-preservation. And I think as abolitionists, we really have to realize the benefit of bringing along the community in community-based research, in actively understanding. Abolition is a culture. It's something we need to learn that has multi components to it, where we learn about, yes, what our communities need, how to engage our communities, how to be a community, so that when things happen, we can depend on each other. But at the same time, to learn and deeply learn the roots and how police have infiltrated our lives and are sucking us dry of resources that we need, and how this is all a component of white supremacy. And I think as abolitionists, and even in my own journey, spending that time to really uproot that and be honest with ourselves on who and how different players are contributing and benefiting from this, we can better strategize when we create things as roadblocks to police expansion. Because what I feel like I see is just a rush for a win, a rush for a title, a rush to, to stop, where at one point we're going to have to realize that if we don't know like the full story, or don't kind of share this full story with each other and work with each other, that, we kind of will keep putting ourselves in this cyclical moment where we're talking about something beyond now data-driven policing that they renamed, that they have a new kind of system to do. And so I really drew a lot of inspiration for that, and kind of realizing why we value that culture building, and that building a culture of resistance, where we're teaching each other, how to file PRAs, how to understand different technologies. I mean, even that pamphlet you saw, I mean, it's a parent that created it, not someone who's a lawyer or who's an academic or who their specialty is policing. And I mean, and that is the culture we need to cultivate within each other.
Yeah, I just, and I see Colleen, there's a question coming. I just want to maybe answer to this answer, or add to this answer too, is yeah, I mean, I think when people ask, what community organizing is, or even just what the coalition does, I don't know, Hamid and Jamie, if you'll agree with this, but I just, in my experience, working with the group and kind of, not kind of being here from the beginning, I often think that the primary thing that the coalition does, there's of course the direct action, the grassroots advocacy, and the community-based research, but more than anything, it's collective study, it's collective learning, it's getting together, teaching, learning with each other in the way of, I mean, and previously I used to do a lot of work with incarcerated organizers and political prisoners, and in the same way of like kind of prisoner study groups and kind of, building collective knowledge and study and analysis and learning from each other. That I think is almost like so core to the work. And that's just, we live in a country where there is not much political education, if any, or what does exist is very much telling the wrong narrative. So that kind of just learning together and word that's thrown around a lot, but like the kind of decolonizing language or decolonizing kind of even the knowledge and understanding and analysis of this stuff. So it is generated by the community, produced by, parents and nurses and youth and yeah, so that's a big part of it. And as a lawyer, especially, and to the extent this is for a law school, and there might be law students or others in the audience, is like it's been not only a process of learning, like you're talking about, Jamie, but also unlearning. Like for me, a lot of unlearning kind of the ways that I was taught to think about the politics of these things, and even just like you were talking about, of that cycle of chasing wins. And really unlearning that, because the legal profession, I think more than any other institution in society, has been really not just complicit but responsible for, over time, refining, expanding, producing this kind of vast bureaucracy that we now have, that's used to process and harm and incarcerate and police so many people. So especially like, how do we take kind of this like legal expertise, legal professional authority away, and really learn how, as lawyers or as anyone else, like what it means to participate in our communities and kind of build grassroots power. So yeah, Colleen, I see you have a question.
Just building on that, I have a client who's been telling me for a while now about, he's a homeless man, about the surveillance that's being directed at him. And it's difficult to hear all this, because at a certain level, I say, well, he's just hypervigilant and paranoid. But there's a lot of truth to this. And in fact, my communications with him on his phone were taken away. There was some filter or something applied that he could no longer see any text messages I was sending to him. He didn't do anything to do this. He's got a government issued phone, and now all of a sudden we can't communicate on it. We tried different ways, and it kept getting blocked. So I saw it there. And so I think maybe to keep our minds open, that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you, and that there's a lot of learning we can do from our clients and the people we serve.
And I think this, thank you for raising that, Colleen, because we get caught up into kind of just kind of waving it off as people are paranoid, but psychops and psychological warfare is real. Just mind control, and this could be all conspiracies and all of that, but that is a real thing. A lot of experimentation continues to happen. And if we are looking at law enforcement as an extension of counterinsurgency tactics, because they actually are. I mean, we know that the LAPD had about 70 Marine Corps assigned to them in the 2000s, and it's all documented, who cruised the streets of South Central Los Angeles with the LAPD and learned the urban guerrilla warfare tactics, which were then used in Al-Anbar province and all. I mean, LAPD trained the El Salvadorian paramilitary squads in the 1980s. They are there in preserving and maintaining the Zionist apartheid in Israel, and how they work very closely with the Israelis as well. So I think there's a lot to be said, but we also want to share that we celebrate as well, and we just and I'm just going to show a quick 2-minute video on one of the let me just go back real quickly before I do that. Go this, and
We have built a culture of resistance to these programs.
Victory for a really small grassroots organization. As you mentioned, their name is Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. They had a news conference that wrapped up about an hour ago, but they won this case in Superior Court back in October. They chose today to talk about it because today is International Human Rights Day, and they say that what the LAPD is violating is basic human rights.
it does feel like a victory. Anytime that you win a groundbreaking lawsuit, it is a victory, definitely. And it gives us more information for us to help families as we try to determine what has happened and why it happens, knowing where laser zones are, even knowing more and more about what people are on the list. These things are important.
The power we have built as a community has been tremendous.
Why do we say that data will be policing? Shut it down! Chief would dare say it was just an experiment. It was just an experiment. The thing that he calls an experiment for us is ways in which we have to save our lives. We must love and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Okay, enough.
It is our duty to win.
I'm going to recess. We're going to recess and clear the room, and then we will finish with the media.
Well, if any other last minute comments or questions or anything? Well, thank you all very much, and we look forward to joining the fight. Just join us on our Tuesday webinars. Hit us up on our social media handles and